Our next speaker is going to be Daniel Sävborg. Daniel is a professor of Scandinavian studies at the University of Tartu, and after research positions in Stockholm, Uppsala, and Iceland, so in the Scandinavian world, actually, he came back here. So now Daniel is going to give us a talk on Ginnungagap, the abyss before the creation of Earth. Ganis, thank you very much in advance.
Yeah, thank you a lot for that. Yes, the Eddic poem Völusbá is usually dated to the 10th century, and that is from pre-Christian pagan time in Iceland. It's preserved in manuscripts which are later, but that's true for all Icelandic texts from the 13th century. But it's usually dated to the 10th century. And the poem is a monologue by a völva, that is a seeress. And the völva tells about the origin of the world, about important facts and events among the Nordic gods. And in the second part of the poem, she also tells about the future, about the end of the world and a new world and so on. But I will focus here on the beginning of the poem, which tells about the creation. And in the first two stanzas, she addresses Odin and the gods in general and men in general, and also informs us that her memory goes far back in time. But then the interesting thing comes. The stanza 3 in Völusbá that starts her narration, and she tells about the state before the creation. And I have here both the Icelandic text and the translation, but I will use only the translation now. So, it was in the beginning of time, when nothing was. Sand was not, nor cool waves. Earth did not exist, nor heaven on high. The mighty gap was, gap Ginnunga in the original, but no growth. So if we summarize this, we can see that the stanza mentions what did not exist originally. No earth, no heaven, no sea, and no sand, growth, or waves. And this list seems to be a sort of specification of the information in the 7th line, that the only thing that actually did exist, the only positive information here, is that there existed a gap. And a gap means gap, open mouth, void, empty space. The meaning of Ginnunga is about this void is more problematic and actually debated. It has often been connected with the verb gina, which means to yawn, to gape. And there is an old High German noun connected with this verb, and that is actually Ginnunga. But that's not attested in Old Norse. But Ginnunga would also mean open mouth, and there is a scholar who have connected this and seen Ginnungagap as a loan for Old High German, but that's not the established idea. There is also an Icelandic noun which is attested ginning, and that means deception, but nobody has really been able to make any sense of this meaning in the context of Ginnungagap, so this is not so much discussed. But many scholars also prefer to connect this Ginnunga in Ginnungagap with the prefix gin in some words, such as ginnheilagur and ginnregin. And heilagur means holy and regin means gods. So gin could then be a sort of intensifying prefix. So ginnheilagur would be enormously holy, and ginnregin would be great mighty gods, and gap Ginnunga would then be something like an enormous mighty void. But other scholars, such as Jan de Vries, has pointed to the fact that gin as a prefix only appears in connection with heilagur and regin, that very clearly religious words, and that gin would then have a distinct sacral meaning, and gap Ginnunga would then mean something like a magical powerful void, according to Jan de Vries. I will not go deeper into this linguistic debate because it doesn't really affect my discussion too much. The term gap is under all circumstances clear, and so is actually the description in stanza 3 of Völuspá, with this description of this emptiness. So what we can conclude is thus that we have to do with an abyss before the creation, which in this stanza seems to be entirely empty, this abyss really. Nothing at all existed. I mean, that's mentioned again and again in this stanza 3 of Völuspá. And of course, it's easy to see the similarity with the biblical view in Genesis that neither earth nor heaven existed originally, and I will return to this similarity later. But since we seem to have to do with a total emptiness, a sort of non-existence of everything, the interesting question is, of course, how this initial pre-creation state changed, how things started to exist, and what caused this change to happen. And in the Bible, of course, you know, this guy, God, did all this. He created heaven and earth. But Völuspá is not particularly clear on these quite crucial points. But in the following stanza 4 in Völuspá, the creation seems to be going on actually. So stanza 4 tells that this initial state lasted, and now I quote, and you see the text here, until the sons of Bur lifted up the earth, or the lands, those who created the glorious Midgard. The sun shone from the south on the hall of stones. Then the soil was grown over with green plants. It is not mentioned from where they lifted up the earth or the lands, but the context certainly indicates that they lifted it up from the abyss that is mentioned, this gap Ginnunga, which is mentioned in stanza 3. And this seems to indicate that this gap, this abyss, was not completely empty after all. And it's not clear or indicated how the earth or lands was created, actually came to existence. It says that it was lifted up. And it's not clear or indicated from where these sons of Bur came or who their father Bur actually was. It seems to be taken for granted in the poem that they existed already in the initial state during the time of total emptiness described in the previous stanza 3. And at this point the story seems to resemble actually the biblical Genesis, where God also existed before the creation. And sometimes it's claimed by scholars who want to to stress the difference between Völuspá and Genesis, like François Xavier Dillman, for example, that there should be a difference between Völuspá and the Bible, in that there was a creator during the time of the abyss before the creation in the Bible, but no such creator in Völuspá. But as we see, this is not completely clear in Völuspá. The sons of Bur seem to have existed before the creation too. And I think this idea of a difference is rather based on a confusion between the creation story in Völuspá and other Old Norse mythological stories about the creation. And I will return to them. But the stanza says that the sons of Bur created the world, but it's not clearly indicated how or what they created it. The word skapa is the normal word used for create, and that's mentioned here. They skapa, it's the verb skapa. It usually means create, but it can also mean give shape to or design. So it might be possible to interpret the words in the stanza that they lifted up an already existing earth from the abyss, and on the basis of this they designed the world as we have it now. But that seems to contradict the explicit claim in stanza 3 that earth did not exist. Jörð fanns eigi, it clearly says in stanza 3. Jörð fanns eigi. Earth did not exist. So stanza 4 then, which we have here, could rather mean then that the sons of Bur created the world by lifting it up. So the uplifting itself would be a part of the creation, but it's certainly not clear really how we should interpret this. But as we can see about this key stanza in Völuspá about the origin of the world is that a lot is unclear. Who are the sons of Bur? Who is Bur? From where did he and they come? From where did they lift the earth? And how and out of what did they create the world? And all these obscurities might certainly be because there were no any clear answers in the Nordic mythology or pre-Christian religion at these points. But it might also be explained by the poetic technique of Völuspá. The poem is not a detailed chronological narrative, it rather consists of short, quite graphic visions of events and characters and facts, probably well known for the contemporary audience. So the answers on those questions I mentioned might therefore be well known by the contemporary audience, and the description not obscure for them at all. The following stanzas in the poem continue to tell of the creation of the stars, the sun, the moon, and dwarfs and men, etc. But I will leave this out since this conference is about abyss, and I will focus on precisely the abyss and the transition from the abyss into a created world. Yes, so far I talked about Völuspá, about the transition from an original sort of nothingness or of chaos to a world of some order. But the description in all modern handbooks, both popular handbooks and scholarly handbooks and school books about the creation in Old Norse mythology, looks quite different. And maybe you have met this picture in school actually, and you have probably heard about Ymir and a cow and so on. And now you wonder, of course, what about Ymir and the cow? And that standard description is also based on an Old Norse source, but it's not Völuspá, and it's in fact not a pre-Christian work at all. This picture, which is a standard view in all handbooks, is found in Snorri Sturluson's Edda. And Snorri Sturluson's Edda, written about 1220, that means more than 200 years after the conversion of Iceland, is primarily a poetological treatise on the composition of skaldic poetry, but it also includes a long section about old pagan mythology. And there we get an extensive and detailed story about the creation of the world in the pagan mythology. And at first we are told about a certain Alföður, father of all, later identified as the highest god Odin. He smíðaði himin og jörð, he created heaven and earth. And then the crucial question is asked in Snorri's work, and I quote, "What was the beginning? How did things start? And what was there before?" End of quote. And as an answer on this question, stanza 3 from Völuspá is quoted, the one I started with, quoted in full, with all its description of emptiness and non-existence. But immediately after this quotation, we get new information. And then it said in the text, "It was many ages before the earth was created that a Niflheim was made." And after a lot of details and places in this Niflheim, we are told, but first was the world in the southern region called Muspel. So, in short, before the creation there were places after all. First something called Muspel, and then something called Niflheim was made, unclear of what and by whom, still before the creation of earth. But how do these named locations relate to the gap Ginnunga, the empty void described in Völuspá stanza 3, which is after all quoted in full in Snorri's Edda? So this is described in the next section of Snorri's Edda. So what in Völuspá is described as gap Ginnunga is in Snorri's work used as a place name, Ginnungagap. We are told that Niflheim is the northern part of Ginnungagap and Muspel is the southern part. Niflheim is icy and cold, Muspel is hot and burning. And between these parts of Ginnungagap, rivers are flowing called Elivagar. And as you see, this is quite a different description of the pre-creation state than the one we get in Völuspá. This is not an empty void at all. The word Gap Ginnunga is indeed taken over from Völuspá, his Norse work, in the form of the place name Ginnungagap. But now this is a clear place where several different locations in it. Locations with places, with names and placed geographically, south and north, and full of materia and activity. So I don't think we can call this an abyss anymore, although it's the description from Völuspá about this abyss is also in Snorri's Edda. And then in Snorri's Edda we get a story of the creation, very different from the one in Völuspá. It said that when the ice from Nibelheim and the fire from Muspel met, and now I quote Snorri's Edda, the rime thawed and ripped, there was a quickening from these flowing drops due to the power of the source of the heat, and it became the form of a man, and he was given the name Ymir. But the frost giants call him Eyrgelmir. And note that a living being simply appears from a mixture of fire and ice. There is no creator here, nor any living being before these locations, rivers, ice and fire, etc. And the story continues, describing that Ymir's sweat in his left armhole becomes giants, and his 2 feet have sex with each other and beget more giants. And then we are told about the appearance of a cow called Audumbla, also coming from the drops of the thawing rime, and her milk feeds Ymir. And the cow licks some salty stones, and a man appears from this called Buri, and he gets a son, unclear how, called Bur, and Bur marries a giant woman, and then get 3 sons, among them Odin. And the sons of Bur kill Ymir, and then they create the world out of his body parts. So, and there we have the created world in Snorri's Edda. To summarize, in Snorri's Edda, a lot of things are actually going on already before the creation of the world. And that is indeed a very, very different story of both the creation and the pre-creation state compared to the one we met in Völuspá, stanza 3. And as mentioned, Snorri actually quotes Völuspá, but most of what he tells does certainly not come from there. So what is Snorri's source for this information? A lot of these facts actually come from another Eddic poem dated to the 10th century, Vavþrúðnismál. In Vavþrúðnismál we meet the names Ymir and Eyrgelmir, clearly for giants, but they are not identified with each other as it was in Snorri's work. There Ymir and Eyrgelmir is the same person. And the rivers Elivagar are also mentioned as in Snorri's Edda. And so is their rule for the origin of a giant, but we don't know who that giant was. But here is no mixture of fire and ice, but the venomous drops create this giant. And the origin of the race of giants from a giant's sweat and feet is also mentioned, although this giant is not mentioned by name. The creation of the world out of Ymir's body parts is also mentioned, but it is not mentioned that he was killed or who killed him or who built the world, as Snorri tells so much about. So we might note many differences from Völuspá. In Vavþrúðnismál, no Ginnungagap is mentioned and no indication at all of any sort of abyss or empty void or something like that. And no sons of Bur are mentioned, and the world is not lifted up, but created from body parts. And everything in this story in Vavþrúðnismál concerns giants, actually, and no gods or other beings are mentioned. And in contrast, of course, in Völuspá, no Ymir is mentioned, and actually no giant stories are mentioned. No Elivagar nor any venomous drops are mentioned. So we must conclude that these 2 poems, which are basically from the same time, from the 10th century, both of them pre-Christian, they give 2 completely different stories about the origin of the world and its pre-state. And both these stories are genuinely pagan from the pre-Christian time, but they're very, very different, really. And Snorri Sturluson in his Edda, he uses both these old poems and constructs a coherent whole by combining them, adding information also from others, sometimes lost sources, and interpreting obscure passages, etc. in a quite fancy way sometimes. He takes the abyss, Ginnungagap, from Völuspá, and he takes the giants and rivers from Vavþrúðnismál, although this makes his story contradictory actually. He mentions an empty abyss of nothing, and at the same time he describes it as full of places and events. He takes the sons of Bur as creators from Völuspá, but connects them with the creation of the world out of a giant's body parts from Vavþrúðnismál. And although Bur's sons in Völuspá were connected with a completely different form of creation of the world, namely lifting it up. So it's very contradictory in Snorri's story. And you could see, of course, many of these differences yourself. We have no reason to believe that the coherent story told in Snorri's Edda has ever existed in pre-Christian time, or actually before Snorri's work at all. It's probably Snorri's work, really, this combination and interpretation. Nevertheless, it's this construction we meet in most handbooks and overviews of Old Norse or Nordic mythology, both scholarly and popular. But Snorri's combination of sources seems to have been influential already in the Middle Ages. In later versions of Völuspá, we have it in several manuscripts, the line, when nothing was, Þar ekki var, in the poem, as you can see it here. It is in stanza 3. It's replaced by when Ymir made his settlement, Þar Ymir byggði. So the original empty abyss thereby becomes a place where a giant lived, exactly as in Snorri's Edda. And I think Snorri's Edda is the source for this rewriting of Völuspá. And some comments might be made here. What is described in Völuspá stanza 3, which I quoted in the beginning and which you see there, is clearly an abyss, an empty void before the creation. The poem is almost certainly pre-Christian, but this picture of an original abyss lived side by side in pre-Christian time in the Nordic countries with another view of the creation where there was no abyss, and that is a picture found in Vavþrúðnismál from basically the same time as Völuspá. And when Snorri in the 13th century makes his construction using several pre-Christian sources, including Völuspá, one could expect that he, as a Christian, would choose the description closest to the Christian view. But actually, the opposite is the case. While the description of the abyss in Völuspá stanza 3 is quite close to the picture in the Bible, Snorri takes much more from the competing description in Vavþrúðnismál, where there is no indication of an abyss. Snorri does indeed quote Völuspá's words about the original empty state, this abyss, but this picture is not the one dominating his description. Instead, Snorri actually focuses on the most non-biblical facts, the most barbaric, the most nasty elements in Vavþrúðnismál, the most bizarre facts of feet having sex with each other and sweat in armholes become living beings and so on, and the creation of the world out of parts from the corpse of an ogre rather than lifting the world up. He focuses on horrific giants rather than on gods as the first living beings. So Snorri's Ginnungagap is certainly a chaos without order, but no empty void really, no abyss in, I think, the standard sense. Let's see how much time. Snorri's view of Ginnungagap actually was influential, and Snorri was very influential as an author. And that seems to have become the standard in the Icelandic High and Late Middle Ages, because we meet the name Ginnungagap several times in later Middle Ages. In learned geographical works from the 13th century, Ginnungagap is placed in our world, actually, in the real geography of our world, but far away in the periphery. It's placed beyond Greenland and Vinland, of course, North America. And Ginnungagap is said to be a connecting link to the mare oceanum surrounding the entire world. So this is as far as way it can come. There we have the Ginnungagap. And in another high medieval work, Ginnungagap is used for the dangerous maelstrom in the ocean. It's a very threatens to take people down in the water. And we also find Ginnungagap in some actually post-medieval maps, but based on medieval sources. And again, Ginnungagap is placed in the periphery, really, in the dangerous parts of the world map. So in these cases, especially in the case of the maelstrom, I think we can talk maybe about an abyss, but it's rather the dangerous chaos, the absence of order we have to do with, not the empty void of Völuspá. I think I should stop here. I had planned to say something about the possible connections to Christian traditions too, but maybe I will come back to that when there come some questions. So I think I stop here. Okay. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, very much for this talk, which brought us from the shores of Mediterranean and more southern oceans to the Nordic seas. Very interesting and are. Okay, Sven will be the first one.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for this interesting talk. For me, I have only one small remark and one maybe not so small question. The small remark is that, talked about this myth of Ymir in the Veda. Actually, there is a very similar myth of a primordial giant who is dismembered, and then from the members the world is created. So this, that's no abyss, of course, as you said. And my question actually was, I think, what you mentioned last. So what about the Christian text? What word or what words do they use for abyssos?
I have not checked, but the translation of abysses in the medieval Icelandic texts, unfortunately, so I'm not sure. But they did not use the term Ginnungagap in any way. So I think I knew about all the cases of Ginnungagap, and it's used more as a geographical place in the periphery. So it's been taken away from mythology, really, or from the religious stories. But I still think, the description in Völuspá, stanza 3, is quite close to the biblical Genesis, actually. And there is a debate among Old Norse scholars. 100 years ago, there were attempts to basically claim that all Eddic poems were very young, and all the mythological poems were written by Christians in very sort of pastiches very late. But I don't think people believe that now, actually. I think such a poem as Völuspá is not possible really to understand if you see it as created in the Christian Middle Ages, because it takes the old Nordic religion completely seriously. It takes these gods seriously. And that is not what we see in the prose works who work with all these gods. They have problems with the pagan gods. They need to discuss it, but sometimes they make joke of them, and sometimes they create frame stories by claiming that they were really men, human beings, and so on. But just to to write a poem such as Völuspá, which takes all this completely seriously, I don't think it's very likely that they did it in the Christian times. I think it is a pre-Christian poem, and I think all scholars agree with that now. But it's still, of course, possible that it can have been influenced by Christian tradition. If it's composed in the 10th century, that was in a time that was before the conversion, but during a time when many Scandinavians had a lot of contacts with the Christians. So I think it's still possible to see a sort of Christian influence on it. And that's what we plan to discuss here, because we have this old High German Christian poem about the creation, which is very close to Völuspá in many ways. And I think this could be seen as a sort of indication that the Nordic idea about the creation described in Völuspá might have been influenced by Christian tradition. But that took place already in pre-Christian time, in my view. And that could also mean that the idea of this original empty abyss in Völuspá is a quite late phenomenon in Old Norse mythology, and that Vafthrudnismál with its giant stories might, without any abyss, might be the older one.
It brings me to one question, just as to which connects to this what you just said. Is there any evidence? I mean, of how Völuspá related to oral traditions? I mean, of oral traditions of religious practices and so something, because obviously there must have been a strong relation.
I mean, it is from the 10th century, it is composed orally and transmitted orally for a very long time, so it belongs to oral culture. And I don't think it's simply just a sort of copying Christian ideas. I think, of course, it's based on oral traditions, on divine beings. But the description of this origin, this initial state and the creation, I think there might have been a connection. But I don't think Völuspá invented this idea. I think Völuspá, the poet of Völuspá, rather based this description on ideas in his time that were orally told. But I think these oral stories, these oral traditions might have been influenced by Christianity. That's rather my point.
Yeah. Okay. There was one question, yes, Cole.
Yeah, Florian also asked, I would love to ask a question about the possible connections with Christian traditions.
Yeah. Basically, that's, I think, I talked about now so much. So if I should summarize it, summarize my view here, I think it is likely, it's unlikely that Völuspá is written or composed in Christian time. I think it's a genuine pagan poem composed in pre-Christian time. But I think the description might be, or the view of the pre-creation state and the creation might have been influenced by Christian ideas during the Viking Age, because I mean that was really a time when the Scandinavian met the Christian Europe. I think this is quite likely. But many scholars, I mean, there have been a tendency to belong to one group or another. One group claims that all Eddic poems are simply written constructions from the 13th century and there is nothing pagan in them at all. And the other one says, they are very, very old, they are extremely old, there is no connection with Christianity at all. How can you see any connection there? And I think that's wrong. I think during the oral society of Viking Age Scandinavia, it's very likely with a lot of Christian influences, but still in the pagan society. I mean, for pagans, there were no problems at all to be influenced by Christianity. I mean, they were polytheists. They no problems at all to get religious ideas from there and from there and from there. I mean, it's the monotheists who have these problems.
I think Florian has a very more specific question. Florian, would you want to turn on your microphone?
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting paper. And I'm sorry, I thought I could ask the question in person. That's why I put it in slightly vague terms. But it was useful that you repeated this point. I was just wondering, I'm not familiar with this material, but I remember that there's the difference between the Codex Regius and the house book, and the different versions suggest that revelation became, between the versions, revelation becomes more important as a sort of an intertext. So I was wondering if that is also true for Genesis, because I found very interesting what you said about Genesis as a sort of textual influence. But just really to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper.
It's correct that Höeg's book and Codex Regius, which contain two full versions, they are clearly different in the end of the poem, describing the end of the world, Ragnarök. But in the beginning, they're very close to each other, and they have the same text for the first stanzas. But in this case, regarding the beginning of the poem, it is the version quoted in Snorra Edda, which actually is the oldest one, which differs mostly from the others.
Yes, one more question.
But it's certainly true also that there are ideas that the description of Ragnarök might be influenced from the Book of Revelations, or at least Christian traditions about the end of the world.
I have a very short question. Is there anything at all known about the sons of Hur, or Hur himself, and does the name mean anything?
Yes,
I mean,
it means son. Son. Son to some. He is someone's son. So yes, he is the born one. It means basically, literally. But no, we don't know. I mean, Snorri tells this story about the cow licking the salty stones, and then a man appears, and he's called Buri, and he gets the son Bur. But we don't know about Buri from other sources, and we don't know about Bur either from other sources, because Völuspá only mentions Bur's sons. And so most of what we think we know is actually taken from Snorri, who takes a bit from there and bit from there and bit from there, and combines it and interprets and reinterprets. Yes, maybe there was some tradition about Bur as son of Buri, as Snorri says, but we don't find it in any poems. There might have been oral traditions about it, but we cannot know. And the cow, Audumbla, is not attested at all in any poems, for example, only in Snorri's work. But it's such a bizarre event, so it's difficult to think that Snorri just invented it, so probably there was some tradition about it.
Okay, there's one more question from cyberspace.
I think James has a
James, yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. I was just fascinated by this paper. It's very interesting, and I think it's illustrating something very important. That from it, am I right in understanding that you're saying that the oral tradition, it's an oral tradition, it's not a written tradition, it's an oral tradition, is reinterpreting these concepts and trying to situate them within a sort of physical, geographical, spiritual worldview? Is that am I right in understanding it like that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, the description in the poem is quite obscure, and the description of this nothingness is problematic for our to really to grasp. So clearly, Snorri tries to make sense of it in some way and explain what is obscure, and then he uses another poem which actually tells a completely different story and fills in the gaps in the Völuspá story, and becomes his reinterpretation and recreation of it. And it's clearly true that he wants to make a whole thing more physical, really, more understandable, a more chronological development. That and that existed, and they created that of that and that, and so on.
I mean, that seems to be an essential point for us, because I mean, we're trying to grasp something that you're speaking about, but it's difficult. Seems a little like the South American interpretations of the Christian religion that are going to transform. They're going to be full of a sort of pagan, but a much more living, meaningful tradition for them. My second question would be, I mean, I don't think you can answer this today, but for us, it's important. It's now we're moving very much with Netflix and a whole series of fashions into this Nordic worldview, and you do a very good job of situating various ways that we come across these ideas and resituating them with a historical perspective. From your perspective, how do you see this developing, this new fashion for the Norse gods with this transcendental love of chaos, of neon, nothingness and anarchy? How do you see that developing?
I'm not sure. I think it was quite fun that people suddenly had become so interested in Old Norse mythology and that they make action movies about Thor and so on. But I cannot say that I have been very much affected by it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Obvious question, I think, a nice question to maybe close this session now. I think time already requests us. But once again, let's thank all three presenters, Sven, Janina, and Daniel, for their great presentations. Yeah.